David, it's been a truly remarkable last couple of days in terms of U.S. presidential politics. How are you feeling today, David?
I'm very well and kind of excited. I think November the 3rd is somewhat like D-Day for America.
And perhaps the rest of the world. This does seem to be an international criminal operation that touches, a lot of the countries that you and I speak about. David, you've brought forward this notion of the double cross and parallel narratives, and in all of our shows, you've been detailing how these tactics are used. People who are watching our sponsor exclusive broadcast on subscribestar.com/reversecsi, patreon.com/reversecsi storyboards, and Subscribestar and Patreon/crowdsource the truth. They've become familiar with some of this terminology, but I think today, David, we have a unique opportunity to explore this possibility that Donald Trump, in what seems like an extremely clever poker move, chess move, whatever we want to call it, we do have some indicators, David, that Donald Trump may have broken the BBC's parallel narrative, potentially with a parallel narrative of his own. What do you think about that?
Well, when we talk about double and triple and quadruple agents, I start getting a double cross of a parallel narrative makes my head spin. But maybe your brilliant collage here can help clarify that. Let me go out on a limb right at the beginning. I believe, to a significant extent, American hearts and minds, and votes, and purses and wallets have been controlled by the BBC in a joint venture with what was Radio Corporation of America up to 1989 and is now Serco, the Serco Group. And they've developed a very sophisticated cyber attack. Now, back around Pearl Harbor, they wouldn't have called it cyber, etc. But I believe the term there, that technology that was relevant, was the Combined Communication Electronics Board. But I digress. So coming to the picture, the collage you've got there, what's extraordinary is how, with modern technology, you can mount an attack with no physical contact on the internet. And in this collage that you put together, it's got three elements to it. I call it a tri-cyber attack, but maybe that's not the best description. But what Trump is holding in his hand looks to me like a parallel narrative attack. Now, whether it's a parallel narrative attack on Trump, or it's Trump's parallel narrative attack on the bad guys, it's very difficult to say at the moment. I think you're collecting evidence and information, and you lose me with some of the technical stuff about that laptop and how it entered into a repair shop and how the content got transferred, I think, to the FBI, or at least the FBI got activated. Historically, my understanding is they'd had it for about 9 months or whatever, but they hadn't acted on it. Is that correct?
Well, that's just it, David. I think I want to be very clear to our viewers. It's my personal opinion that the information that's coming out of this laptop, it does seem to be authentic. I'm personally very convinced that Hunter Biden and Joe Biden and other members of the Biden family have been involved in criminal activity for a pretty substantial amount of time. And I say that not because of any bias against Joe Biden or crackheads or people who have sex with their sister-in-laws. I'm saying that because there's a lot of evidence that indicates these guys have been doing all kinds of things. And obviously the strongest evidence that we've seen now is coming from this laptop and kind of hovering around the laptop. We've now seen, released by the New York Post, this subpoena for the laptop that indicates that there was a grand jury impaneled. I've got a higher resolution version of it. Some people who post this stuff around the internet choose to decimate the resolution, which I don't understand why they would do that. But this is a subpoena, and the date that the subpoena is issued is December 9th. They are basically asking for the laptop repairman to show up, and the response due date is December 17th. And they're telling him to bring it says that they've got a exhibit thing attached. So here's the second page of it. And on the second page, David, they're talking specifically about an Apple MacBook Pro laptop. It gives the serial number, and I've invited an expert witness to join us. I don't know if he will. He hasn't responded yet, but I'm wondering if we can determine the manufacture date or the specific model of MacBook Pro by evaluating this serial number. There's also an external hard drive, a Western Digital external hard drive. Now, the thing that I was getting at, David, is going back to as far as 2016, Apple MacBook Pros don't actually have a hard drive in them. And as a matter of fact, this was a bit of controversy for Mac users and computer fans in general. Everybody knows that Apple makes really sort of like proprietary systems. And the issue is these computers use solid state memory that's soldered directly to the motherboard. So removing it and dealing with just the hard drive, there's been a lot of confusion in the language in the news reporting as to whether it's a laptop we're talking about or a hard drive that we're talking about. And here we see this attachment to the subpoena talking about one specific laptop and one specific hard drive. So where does this number of 3 come in there? There's just a bit of confusion surrounding this information.
Right. So technically, I'm lost on that. But what intrigues me is the timing of this exhibit just before the election and the possibility that rather like QAnon and various other parties, there's been an approach through a parallel narrative to get a lot of people hovering around or sucked into a sandbox and then to basically dismantle the sandbox. Now
let's address that, though, because if you bring up that word, we're in danger of getting, eliminated, because apparently anybody who follows or promotes that is considered a dangerous conspiracy theorist. And I want to be very clear. I want to make sure I understand your feelings about it, because my feelings, and I think you share them, are that it was specifically created to attract people to it and then say, hey, this is dangerous. Anybody who is supporting it is dangerous. And they've done that with other things. Able danger.
Yes.
Right? So they want to create something that attracts people to it. This is a honeypot. And then crash that thing down so anybody who is into it is seen as an outsider or somebody that should be blocked from the internet.
Yes, and that to me is one of the most important legs of a tri-cyber attack, is a parallel narrative. And we are blessed in BC because I think we have the world's leading practitioner of parallel narrative attacks, who was the founder of the BBC News online desk in 1997 and had the opportunity to develop parallel narratives for various attacks, including the attack on the East African embassy bombing, right, in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam.
I want to keep you focused on the laptop, David, because I don't think this guy has anything to do with it. And I know you love talking about him. You're talking about, I don't want people to think I'm trying to stifle what you're saying, but I know you've been very interested in this guy, Alfred Hermida. My feeling is until we can contact him and ask him some questions, talking about him and speculating about his time at the BBC should be done in a more general sense. I don't see how he would tie to this laptop. But there has been a lot of reporting in the BBC about Hunter Biden's laptop, and I would like to talk about that.
Right. So what also has been talked about in the BBC are the various compromised nodes, the human beings that have fallen into these various traps. So let me give you, in my opinion, a number of compromised nodes that might startle people. Now, compromise above Trump's head on your collage, you got a statue, right? Yes. Which I think exemplifies a compromised node approach by the BBC that dates back to the time that was commissioned, which was 1934. And it's a bearded man holding a naked child in a very suggestive pose. And the sculptor of that is a man called Eric Gill, who was a pedophile. In fact, he actually had incest with his own daughters. So there's a lot of discussion about Eric Gill, his talent as an artist, yes, but his message or that he sends through his sculpture. And just around the corner of that building, we have the Obsculta message. So
Exactly.
how deeply has the compromised node approach or attack penetrated the West or the Five Eyes countries? Well, let me give you an example of one in New York, and that would be Ghislaine Maxwell. Right? Ghislaine Maxwell is or the center of a compromised node that stretches right through Epstein and all his associates, Marvin Minsky, I believe, the consultant in artificial intelligence who worked with me briefly at Ridgefield, the Schlumberger Doll Research Center. So his network is a huge, but at the heart of it is a compromised node that is gathering information about the private lives of people that can then be blackmailed or silenced. Right?
Well, let me take you back just one step, David, because I think we have some new viewers with us today. A lot of people are very interested in hearing about this laptop. And I think it would be wise for us to just remind everybody where this terminology about a compromised node comes from and talk a bit about Cameron Ortis and some of the terms he uses in this PhD thesis, which he talks about bowing to Quirinus and the compromised nodes dealing with cybersecurity in East Asia. That would seem to cover China, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, and Richmond, etc. And bowing to Quirinus, if people haven't heard of that term, Quirinus is a sort of cult god of Roman times, and basically it's an authority. So if you look at the outside of the BBC with those sculptures, I mean, the poses, really, there's an authority figure, which is the bearded man, and there's a child, and then in this one, heaven knows what the proper interpretation of it, but I'll tell you what I think. It looks like a sexualized Jesus being crucified, serenaded by a couple of angels, if that's the right word, and held below his private parts, there's this book that's opened with the word Obsculta. And Obsculta is listen and obey. This also is a 1934 sculpture. So the BBC in the 1960s hosted a guy called Jimmy Savile, who for 50 years basically ran what I would call a compromised node network within the BBC that reached possibly hundreds or thousands of people, including members of the royal family. So you've got Ghislaine Maxwell, an Oxford University alumna, and Jimmy Savile in London. So who do we have in Vancouver? Well, we have Cameron Ortis. Obviously, he's writing about it. Now, whether he was targeted as a node or an operator of a node is not clear. But then there's two very interesting alumni of UBC that should be considered. One is the present Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, and his roommate for 4 years, Christopher Charles Invoudson, who has been charged, convicted, and jailed as a director of an international pedophile ring. Now,
I mean,
what does that mean?
We got to spend a minute on this for a second here, David, because our regular viewers are aware of this, but see, this is super important because there's been a big purge. You know, you and I don't support QAnon from the beginning. I thought it was some sort of operation to bring people into some kind of a trap. I don't think it's helpful or useful, and I think that it's now resulted in a lot of people getting kicked off of Facebook and YouTube and even Patreon, we've heard now, is kicking people off. So again, there are people, David, who have tried to link you and I to this. Obviously, what happened to Field McConnell going to jail, there was a lot of people who wanted to link you to some of the negative and incorrect information that came out of Able Danger. I see this operation here as the same sort of thing. It's interesting that Facebook allowed Justin Trudeau's roommate to distribute child porn on Facebook, but talking about a movement that allegedly wants to bring people like this to justice, that's not allowed on Facebook. What do you think of that, David?
Well, absolutely. So people need to understand that this compromised node network is global, right? There are people who move seamlessly around the world. This guy, Invoudson, has been in jail for directing an international pedophile ring. So it's one arm of the attack that actually has enormous but hidden and very sinister influence on people who will never reveal that they're under attack. Now, there's a few more people in Vancouver that we need to talk about, who are masters, or I believe practitioners, of the compromised node network. One of them is Oliver Buck-Revel, right, who has a company called Images Technologies. He was number 4 at the FBI up to 1994. When he left, he came up physically, or basically established a business in Vancouver called Images Technologies, which is, as far as I understand, the world's leading user of facial recognition and artificial intelligence to track pedophiles around the world. So Oliver Buck-Revel is building, or has built, a real-time facility that if you have the keys into it, you can find out the movements of anyone charged or convicted or suspected of pedophile relationships. And this is in Vancouver. And he's been operating since 1998. Now, how much further does this network extend? Well, look at the raid on Starnet, right? That was 150, I believe, people from compromised nodes in the FBI, the CIA, the IRS, right, US Customs, Vancouver Police, etc., etc. They raided Starnet Communications. You and I visited the premises, right, at 425 Carroll Street, on a basis that it was allegedly engaged in hardcore adult and child pornography in 60 countries and online gaming. Isn't that the ultimate compromised node network operator?
Well, the other thing that's strange about it, David, is that, you know, anybody who's going and criticizing people who want to support this movement and talk about it online, whether it's accurate, inaccurate, fake, or real, I think people have the right to talk about it, but they're just shutting it down, kind of unlike anything we've ever seen before, except for, you know, Twitter censoring this Hunter Biden laptop story from the New York Post.
Right. So we get people who wittingly or unwittingly enable this kind of compromised node approach to take place, or an attack to take place within the justice system. For example, if someone is arrested on suspicion of pedophilia, right, because the FBI has shared with the National Crime Agency a database of 7,000 people who allegedly used their credit cards to download child pornography. I think that was called Operation Ore, or Operation Landslide, or something like that. There were 7,000 suspects identified by the FBI to the National Crime Agency in the UK using, as far as I can tell, this facial recognition tracking from Oliver Buck-Revel. 33 of these people committed suicide. Now, what kind of deals can be done with a corrupted justice system under what might be called the prisoner's dilemma? They might say, well, you can go if you betray your colleague in the next cell, right? And the colleague in the next cell gets life imprisonment because he's abused a child. But maybe the person that's being let out under, let's say, the prisoner's dilemma or the three strikes law is the real killer. So it's possible, and I've coined that phrase, where you have an online judicial elite that is deploying an online criminal insurgency.
Right.
And so we now find this company, Cameron Ortis, is under arrest right now. He's the former head of intelligence of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, put there by Justin Trudeau. And when they went to his home, they found 30 computers, which I understand, if they didn't get the password right, would erase their own database.
Right. But we've spoken about all this. The thing that I really want to get into that's interesting is that we know Jeffrey Epstein was involved in child pornography, child rape, child trafficking. We know that Jimmy Savile was involved in all these things. We know that these members of the RCMP, these associates of Justin Trudeau, specifically Christopher Charles Ingvelson, he's been arrested for child pornography, pedophile-related charges, but yet they seem to, in the mainstream news, including the BBC, perhaps driven by the BBC, they want us to believe that the notion that there is a group online that wants to eradicate pedophilia is absurd. even though there are things about it that I do disagree with, I don't think banning it in this way is appropriate, given what they're telling us. This is what we really want to focus on, I think, David, is the parallel narratives coming out of the BBC. Now, getting back to the laptop for a second, everybody knows that the New York Post did this huge expose of the laptop, and we're hearing now allegations from Rudy Giuliani that in his own text messages, Hunter Biden is telling us that he created an unsafe environment for the children in his house. He's talking about it in the text messages. So, I mean, it's an allegation, it's his own statement, but yet BBC is talking about Twitter changing their policy. And this is interesting, David. I'd like your input on this, because they're not coming forward and saying, hey, you know what, evidence seems to indicate that Hunter Biden might have been up to something. They're not showing us the business associate who's testifying in front of the Senate. They're not showing us the subpoenas and stuff. They're telling us about Twitter updating a policy which led it to block people from sharing a link. They're saying that the hacked materials policy initially blocked it, and now they're just going to flag it as containing hacked material. Now, to people who aren't digging into the facts and details, this story, David, reiterates the false statement that the laptop was hacked.
Right. So isn't that what I believe in spy terms they call the limited hangout, right? So they don't want you to go all the way and find out how pervasive this network is. So they leak out a little concession, right, through Twitter. Oh, well, we shouldn't have banned it, but let's change our law about hacking until the hacking is proven. But you see, that already implies it was hacked.
Right.
And of course, if it was hacked, then the evidence subtracted from it would be inadmissible in a court. And you'd be back to the same relief that Bernardine Dawn and Bill Ayers got because the FBI didn't get a warrant to, eavesdrop or so. So the same logic, I think, applies today. You've got this network that exists in place, and by parallel narratives, subtly adjusted, you can get the public to believe they've learned enough to stop investigating further.
But you've just gone over a huge topic that I think a lot of people aren't going to know. See, but people who are seeing us for the first time don't realize, David, your brain is like a vault, jam-packed with all this information. And sometimes you'll drop out a sentence that perhaps requires some explanation for the audience to keep up with us. But Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers were the leaders of the Weather Underground. And Oliver Buck-Revel, who you brought up earlier, was involved in investigating them in the 1970s, and they ultimately did not go to jail despite planning bombings and essentially, achieving bombings and essentially being domestic terrorists. They did not go to jail because of errors and improprieties in evidence gathering that the FBI, basically botched the case. And famously, Bill Ayers walked out of the courthouse saying, guilty as sin, but free as a bird. So it causes us to question, David, does the FBI have the ability at any given moment to, let's say, spy on somebody, hack into their stuff now, get all this information? We've heard Robert Mueller speak about parallel construction, and he's publicly stated that he thinks that's a good idea. What Robert Mueller meant when he said that was he can, through a variety of illegal surveillance tactics, learn something about a suspect, but if he's using illegal surveillance and he wants that person to go to jail, they can't submit evidence that's obtained illegally. So it seems like for almost any suspect, the FBI can decide to go one way or another. Do we have a parallel narrative that allows us to represent that this evidence was legally obtained versus the real narrative, which is that it may be illegally obtained, as it was in the case of the Weather Underground? What can we say about that?
Well, you're absolutely right. The ability to switch between parallel narratives, obviously, if you're on the inside and you have the information about who's going where, let's take, for example, Oliver Buck-Revel. Remember, he rushed onto the tarmac and picked his son and daughter-in-law off the tarmac at Heathrow Airport before Pan Am 103 took off and got blown up over Lockerbie. So what did he know and when did he know it? I think he was plugged into a parallel narrative. That is to say, there was a network of people in the FBI who were aware of these things going on, and they decided that they would, obviously take off their high-value targets, which would be the man's son. But then he comes up to Vancouver, and he runs probably the world's biggest tracking system using face recognition, right, through all of these various agencies, including IRS, Department of Justice, and so on and so on. So the parallel narrative option for a node, a compromised node, is extraordinarily powerful and dangerous, because people like Justin Trudeau may very well make a decision to send the investigation one way and not the other, and basically shield people from arrest and justice. And I think in Canada and the United States, we're now faced with a situation where, to a very large extent, crime scene investigations, the outcome is controlled. And you know that word outcome interests me, because there's a particular guy who has a patent for interactive wagering on event outcomes that I think is entirely relevant to our discussion.
Right. Well, so what I sort of want to explore, David, though, is how this idea of competing parallel narratives pertains to this story, which seems to be the biggest news story in the world, that some of the biggest news agencies, including the corrupt, perverse BBC, seem to want to bury. And I mean, how can we continue to explore down this line, David? Because some people are feeling, despite the fact that the evidence seems authentic, the FBI had it for some time, they weren't doing anything. Is there some possibility that Trump has double-crossed the BBC and is now playing their own parallel narrative game against them?
Absolutely. And the equal possibility, I don't know about equal possibility, is going the other way around, that he's gone into a trap. We don't know the detail. And that's where that third iconic image that you put up on this collage today is so important, because there you have the four aces of the Trump network. You see, and very interestingly, Trump appears to have been installed at the BBC, maybe as early as 1997 or 1980. And
Trump,
it allows
you mean the trial usability maturity process? Yeah.
Yes, that is an interface, right, into different elements of software that allow you to synchronize them and would allow you to create a parallel narrative. So the BBC online news desk adopted a Trump interface around the 1997 period, right, and then was able to drive parallel narratives through the events of the East African embassy bombing or the 9/11 attack. And what I believe has happened with this Trump narrative, that is now hooked through to the big casinos so they can actually gamble on the outcome of these events. Now, Trump obviously built casinos along the East Coast, and I believe there's no coincidence there. They called it Trump because they could identify the cockpit, the template, or the dashboard with Trump, and basically he would be damaged by association. But I think that Trump project actually ties the compromised nodes to the parallel narratives and allows you to synchronize the three legs of a cyber attack. And I think right now the United States is under a cyber attack from these three components. Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's little doubt. We've seen that with all the social engineering that's been going on. And it's a cyber attack that is basically characterized by fake news. We've seen the BBC and lots of other affiliates spreading this kind of fake news. So, I mean, again, the issue for me with this BBC article is that they're not addressing any of the actual facts. They continue to put forth, I mean, it's complicated for people to absorb, because it is a fact, I suppose, that Twitter has changed its policy about hacked information, but it's not addressing that there's nothing to indicate that this laptop was hacked.
Yeah, but you see, by inserting that language, right, people start to process that and say, well, what if it was hacked? And then if it's hacked, it's inadmissible evidence, right? So before the election, I think there are real underlying facts that would be hugely embarrassing to the Biden family and maybe actually preclude him getting elected as president. So they're desperately anxious to basically to make sure the evidence is inadmissible by alleging, directly or indirectly, that it was actually acquired by a hacker.
Well, right. I mean, we have no evidence to indicate that it was acquired by a hacker, and I want to be excessively clear that it's my belief that the information on the laptop is authentic. Here's the idea that I'd like to introduce, David, that I hope people will think about. We know the sequence of events is that this guy, the laptop repair guy, receives the laptop in his store in April of 2019. There's a date here on the receipt somewhere. Where did we see that date? Well, maybe not on this copy, but it comes into the store in April of 2019. It's signed by Hunter Biden. It says quantity 1, label, hardware level 1, $85. This is not very descriptive, and if we're talking about data recovery, it sounds like a low price for that service to me. I wanted to ask our expert witness here, who is experienced in fixing computers, if he felt that it would work. Now, someone's telling me that this is an Apple MacBook Pro Core i5 mid-2017 tech table. I guess someone has done what I suggested and looked up the, no, this is just no, sorry. I've been distracted by a comment there, which may be their goal. But what I want to focus on is the confusion surrounding this laptop store. This is telling us one $85 service request, April. They say that Hunter came back to the store. We don't know exactly why, but the subpoena, the grand jury subpoena, is talking about 2 specific items, a laptop and a hard drive. Now, again, this is all vague. I'm a little concerned that there hasn't been more specific explanations surrounding how it got from the laptop store to Rudy Giuliani and to President Trump. What about this scenario, David? Because we have no reason to distrust the laptop repairman or any of these other people, but if someone acting honestly gets this laptop in the store, April, he fixes it or whatever, Hunter Biden never comes back. The guy hears about Hunter Biden in the news, he looks on the laptop, he sees all this crazy stuff, he gives it to the FBI. April to December, they have the thing, nothing happens. He goes to the grand jury in December, testifies. Here we are, October, nothing happens. What if, David, the laptop store guy said, hey, wait a minute, the FBI has taken this evidence, and just like when I drove Laurel Everly to the DC Capitol Police to give them her evidence, they did nothing with it. They gave it to the defense. It seems like the law enforcement offices are actually destroying evidence or suppressing investigations.
Well, that comes back to the compromised node logic. When they raided Starnet, which would have connected you if you had the opportunity to take that to court and investigate all their nodes, it would have taken you to people who have been compromised around the world, right? But the evidence being taken away by up to 100 to 100, it's probably the biggest joint raid in Canadian-American police history. And all of that evidence has been taken away. Presumably the content is put up on, I don't know, the cloud or whatever. So isn't that a classic example of the degree to which you control society if you put those 3 elements together? The ability to inject parallel narratives, the ability to track people through compromised nodes and extort their silence, right? And then the ability to take privileged information through Trump, that Trump interface, and place bets, like, for example, Cameron Ortis, remember, he was in contact with the Phantom Secure crime group in Richmond, which had 20,000 members, elite criminals around the world, engaged in drug trafficking and murder for hire and money laundering. So isn't there an integration of those compromised node networks, the parallel narrative injection to send justice in the wrong direction, and then the ability to assemble vast amounts of money through the casinos to launder through gambling of the worst kind? Over to you.
I think you and I are going in two different directions right now, David. I want to talk about how the laptop and the parallel
Okay.
narrative coming from the BBC and going to all these news agencies pertains to what's going on with that laptop. I agree with you that, betting on event outcomes is a topic that comes into play here, but I just feel like there are so many people involved who you and I deal with all the time. I mean, another person who is essentially representing a compromised node is Barry Diller and the Daily Beast. And, they are on the BBC bandwagon where they're saying that the FBI is examining the laptop as a foreign op, contradicting Trump's intelligence czar. Now, do we know that the FBI is doing that? I think they've pretty much said that they agree that it's not Russian disinformation. And here we have the Daily Beast contradicting that, towing the same line as the BBC. So is the BBC sending news to Daily Beast? I mean, certainly the Daily Beast reports on, information having to do with the BBC. They're telling us that an editor quit in protest of a gender pay gap. They seem to be getting news from the BBC.
Well, yeah, so going back to the laptop, remember, that's probably a feed through the Trump device where you can actually feed news or propaganda through to the Daily Beast. I believe the parent injector of news and propaganda, right, and parallel narratives is the BBC. And that feeds people like the Daily Beast and Barry Diller with the news that they want coordinated around the world. So I think the BBC or the laptop, it's like a temporary bus stop with the feed coming from the BBC through the laptop and into, for example, a whole group of compromised nodes that basically are desperate to get this interpreted as a hack and therefore inadmissible. I think there is real evidence on that laptop. There's real images that are extremely compromising for certain people, and they're desperately anxious to get it dismissed. They can't prove it's false, but they can get it dismissed or inadmissible in court. And I think that's the goal of planting the network, planting the laptop at this particular time.
And doesn't it seem, I mean, here we've got the Daily Beast reporting on the BBC's director of news stepping aside due to a child abuse scandal. They talk about Jimmy Savile. I mean, everybody knows that this type of child abuse is going on. You would think that if there was even suspicion of child abuse, and we've heard Rudy Giuliani say that Hunter Biden's own text messages to either his sister-in-law or his girlfriend, whatever she is, he's admitting that he's creating an unsafe environment for children. I don't know if that's technically child abuse, but it sounds like it's falling under the same heading. You would think that legitimate news organizations would be very concerned about what's going on with this laptop and finding out what the evidence on it is, but they're all aligned to suppress it and say it's not real. So let's explore for a second, David, the possibility that perhaps it was hacked. What if the laptop guy got the real laptop from the real Hunter Biden, brought it to the FBI? They do nothing. He makes some kind of effort. They say, okay, we're going to have a grand jury or whatever it is that goes on within the FBI and the RCMP to make it look like they're investigating, but they're actually suppressing evidence. Let's say this laptop store guy finds out that the FBI is not doing anything or gets the feeling that the FBI is not doing anything. We've learned that his father is an ex-Air Force guy who has a relationship with people in the CIA. Wouldn't it be possible, because the NSA, we're aware, is capturing everybody's data everywhere, if this guy gave the laptop to the FBI and they did nothing, if somebody had access to the NSA, they could potentially recreate the contents of the laptop by going back to stored data that the NSA has, and then they would need their own parallel narrative to put this evidence into court in a way that it could be admissible. It kind of, if this hypothetical scenario took place, it would kind of represent Trump flipping the script on the BBC, essentially double-crossing the BBC with a parallel narrative, but instead of directing the public away from the truth, this parallel narrative directs us to the truth. What do you think of that?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, I'm a chess player, right? So you're looking at the body language and the moves of the opposition. You're trying to work out what their next step is. So if we rerun what you just described, I think the BBC and its global network of compromised nodes knows exactly what is on that laptop. And a lot of it shows extremely compromising pictures that might put some of the players in jail, just like at Starnet Communications, right? So they work out, well, this might leak out slowly. It's like, the Chinese water torture, where people just spreading rumors. Why don't we go all in and see if we can create a parallel narrative such that eventually it will be treated as a hack and inadmissible? On Trump's side of the fence, I think hopefully he's surrounded with some smart people who are good at playing poker or chess or whatever it is, and they look at this and say, well, how do we defeat it? Right? So I think that's the battle. And I think our listeners are actually at a privileged position because you have just talked to this guy who maybe can understand the mechanics of that computer. Oh, I'm glad you put that up. This is where I think is extremely interesting.
Well, because I want to talk about Hunter Biden relative to this. This is the graphic that you've located that illustrates the prisoner's dilemma. Help us understand this, if you could.
Okay, so let's say you've got two people who are suspected of some serious crime, maybe murder or abuse of a child or whatever, but there's not enough evidence to convict either of them. So you can make offers to one guy and say, look, if you confess, right, then we can blame the friend and the friend gets life imprisonment, or reverse, right? If you both stay silent, you'll get a smaller sentence because we don't have enough evidence to convict you beyond reasonable doubt. So this prisoner dilemma is a game that I think the Rand Corporation developed in the 50s. Ooh. And people can play this, and coming right through to the 3 strikes and you're out. What occurs to me is you could be in a jail and you could be trapped in one of these situations. And if you strike in a certain way, you can be released. I mean, the 3 strike laws are really extraordinary. So under the 3 strikes laws, when Clinton introduced them, I believe the federal prison population went from 94,000 to 240. And Kamala Harris is an expert in this. She administered this 3 strikes law. So we've got people who are potentially in compromised nodes in the jail system who would do anything to get out, including, let's say, plant a laptop.
Well, I was going to say, along these same lines, the prisoner's dilemma could be the potential prisoner's dilemma. And certainly in this scenario, the compromised node is Hunter Biden. So what's the possibility that somebody went to him and said, listen, dude, you're going to spend the rest of your life in jail.
Absolutely.
Why don't you bring this laptop to the laptop store, and perhaps, your father, who's close to dead anyway and is the mastermind of this scheme, he can go to jail and we'll go easy on you. What's the likelihood of that?
Oh, very much so. They betray each other, right? So again, going back to Justin Trudeau and Christopher Charles Invalson, these people, they can get into a situation as a parolee or a fugitive from justice, right? They don't have to be in jail. Remember that Lemelson patent, the tracking of prisoners and parolees using artificial intelligence algorithms. You can play a riff on this, incredibly complex, but you can release people from jail who then pick up a laptop and place it in a repair shop and arrange for it to be interpreted as a hack or a theft or whatever, basically to make sure the evidence is inadmissible.
Yeah, they can take it either way. And it seems like we have a parallel narrative struggle going on right now where the BBC, Twitter, Facebook, NBC News, CBS News, they all want it to be inadmissible. And the Trump narrative is saying this is evidence. It's almost amazing, David. They can't seem to get mainstream news and certainly many members of the public to even take this thing as seriously as it needs to be taken. I remain astounded by the level of, the degree to which things like the New York Times can ignore this evidence. It seems like the biggest story maybe ever, and I'm unable to get the New York Times on the screen here. Trump and Biden, to me, David, this should be the headline on every single newspaper, and here they're just dancing around it. They continue to dance around it, and essentially the New York Times is an apparatchik of the BBC in as much as its CEO, until about 3 months ago, was the former director general of the BBC. David, to what extent has the BBC permeated all news?
Everywhere. Just to give you some of the statistics, weekly audience of 500 million people, 50 languages. It's been going since 1924. It's the world's leading propagandist news and entertainment media. Remember Elmer Davis, the head of the Information War Office in World War II? He said the way to propagandize the public is to inject the propaganda through entertainment media. Well, who does that? Serco, that was RCAGB. So going back to the founder of the online news desk in 1997, he would have been in a position to inject parallel narratives through the Trump interface in real time. So as the news comes in from a crime scene, let's say the laptop that's entered this repair shop, and the gentleman opens it for the first time and he finds some of this compromising material, right? He's basically a witness to a crime scene. But what kind of pressures act on such an individual, right? Does he become an expert victim witness where they say to him, they threaten his business? The point is, if the public allow these nodes, compromised nodes, to exist in the justice system, you don't have justice anymore, right? And you'll have these conspiracies developing, which maybe will control the outcome of the November the 3rd election.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I'm mostly curious about is this discrepancy where we've heard it referred to as a laptop, we've heard it referred to as many as 3 laptops, and we've also heard it referred to as a hard drive. Now, the MacBook Pro itself has not actually had a hard drive in it for several years. It uses solid-state memory that's soldered directly to the motherboard. So there does appear to be another hard drive that's involved, but there's all this sort of vague description going on in terms of exactly what's there. And it seems like the BBC, the New York Times, everybody, except for the Post and independent media like us, want people to think that this is, nothing to look at. And it's also, everybody's said it a million times, David, but I think we would be remiss to not mention that these are all the same news outlets that had far less credible information about anything related to Donald Trump, his impeachment, these allegations that Trump was somehow involved with Russia. All of that never had any foundational basis. And here they're questioning really solid evidence.
Well, again, you have to look at the operator of the parallel narrative interface, which would be Trump. They have no latency. They can change on a dime. They don't have to have a 9-month gestation period to produce this plot. The timing is just before the election, right? If they release it now and they claim it's a hack, there's not time for Trump to prove it's not a hack. If you see what I'm saying.
People aren't getting what I'm saying. We know that external hard drives can be used. We know that people are saying 3 water-damaged devices were brought in there. The issue that I'm bringing up is that, someone is trying to introduce inconsistent evidence related to this laptop because, 3 devices were brought in, okay, but, on this, it's just talking about 1 hardware level 1. So what the hell does that mean? And the subpoena is talking about 1 laptop and 1 external hard drive. Now, text messages and things would not be stored on an external hard drive unless they were deliberately copied there. The MacBook, it's tied into your Apple account, and when you text things on your phone, they show up on the laptop. Hunter Biden could have had it set to back up on this external hard drive, but there's just a bunch of inconsistencies. Anytime we get into these complex technical things, David, whether it's medical stuff pertaining to the virus, cures, treatments, vaccines, details about computers being hacked or downloaded or copied to thumb drives, we start getting into nitty-gritty details when, if each component of it doesn't line up, something is incorrect. And again, I want people to understand that I'm not questioning the authenticity of the information. I'm not questioning whether Hunter Biden and Joe Biden were involved in complex international scandals. I mean, perhaps the best evidence that we have now is this Hunter Biden business partner who's come forward with his, what was his name? Bobolinsky. This guy gave a press conference last night where he is saying that he's got damning evidence. Forget about the laptop, forget about the store. This is the guy who is the recipient of some of these emails. And so this is the Washington Post trying to discredit the guy. But Tony Bobolinsky is a Navy veteran, certainly as credible as that Army guy, what was his name, who testified against Trump. I don't understand why anybody who is against Trump is automatically trusted, and anybody who is for Trump is automatically discredited by things like the Washington Post. But Bobolinsky describes in detail how Hunter Biden tried to use their company to funnel Chinese money to his family and himself. And so it's very possible that if there is any criminal investigation, the laptop itself could become a peripheral element. The fact that we have people who were communicating with Hunter Biden, this now becomes really important. Our viewers are telling us the FBI announced today that they're interviewing Bobolinsky. I think Bobolinsky should be very careful. The FBI loves to do things to jam up their interview suspects or subjects.
Coming back to Cameron Orders, remember the thesis about organized crime in East Asia, right? Using these compromised nodes. So the guy who was the head of RCMP intelligence during this period, presumably, is now in jail. He's written a thesis on compromised nodes in East Asia. He's in contact with a phantom crime group in Richmond, right kitty corner to the River Rock casino. So there's the potential there for making sure that the outcome of this laptop is to deem it to be a hack and the evidence dismissed. What Trump has a problem is, how does he demonstrate, without getting involved in the investigation, that these are fact-based, right? So there you've got the clash. And the parallel narrative is basically to attempt to discredit the viability or the truth of this laptop. And Trump's job, of course, is to try and find some way of making sure that it's recognized as hard evidence before the election, which is November the 3rd. So the guys who control, my allegation is the guy who controls the parallel narrative on this controls this next election.
That's right. Larry Gallus tells us that Hunter Biden is between a drive and a hard place, and that's true. Alexander Vindman is the Army officer who testified against Trump, did not provide email evidence or this type of tangible evidence that Mr. Bobolinsky is providing, but yet Vindman is automatically believed. Bobolinsky is right away, according to the Washington Post, not credible. So, David, we're going to continue to explore this. I think a lot of people here on YouTube aren't exactly understanding what we're saying. We're not challenging the evidence from the laptop. We're just looking at these competing narratives and the war that's going on in the news. So, David, we'll be back in just about 5 minutes with our sponsor-exclusive segment where we will go in depth with far fewer trolls in the chat, less people promoting social engineers and their other channels. I politely ask that people who actually support Crowdsource the Truth don't come into a show about David Hawkins and his theory and try to direct people to other people on YouTube. That's something you can do on your own social media. We're here to talk about subscribestar.com/reverse-CSI, patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, and the in-depth conversation we're going to have on the sponsor-exclusive segment, which is also available on subscribestar.com and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. So, David, we'll continue to explore the BBC and its surrogates when we're back in just about 5 minutes.
Thank you, Jason.
See everybody over there. Thanks.